Welcome to the Continuing Education module, Incentive Deep Dive, Powerful Tools for Health Behavior Change. The agenda for this particular module includes why incentives for wellness are needed, key definitions, pros and cons, potential uses for incentives, pay value issues, incentive effects, and responding to incentive critics, incentive best practices, and then a summary of key points. Why incentives for wellness are needed. First of all, because new wellness behaviors usually require a purpose for the change to be made. We don't usually make changes in our behavior unless there is a reason. Because wellness requires effort to accomplish and a measure of deferred gratification. We don't do well on a deferred gratification. In general, we want immediate gratification. Because wellness has to compete with every other life demand. So incentives around wellness usually need to be formulated and drawn into a program's design. And because how else can you feasibly reach the 80% who are not intrinsically motivated to do wellness? Intrinsic motivation is hard to come by in wellness. So what we end up doing is using extrinsic motivation. The reality is only about 20% of any workforce is intrinsically motivated for wellness. That leaves the other 80% as not intrinsically motivated. And that's where our challenge comes, is how do we in fact include those people and reach them in a way in which they want to engage in wellness-related education and or behavior change. The key definitions around incentives are: incentives we define as an anticipated positive or desirable reward, something that I want, designed to influence the performance of an individual or a group. So I usually have behaviors that represent the performance of the issue that my incentive programs are designed to address. Disincentive is defined as an anticipated negative or undesirable consequence designed to influence the performance of an individual or group. And what I'm oftentimes doing is I'm trying to avoid the disincentive and essentially get the incentive. Now, the incentive is usually what we call the carrot. The disincentive is the stick. So when we think about the use of disincentives, I generally am not in support of the use of disincentives. They are very powerful, but they also leave a residue of dissatisfaction, alienation, distrust, and they usually require a lot more work to overcome than the benefit that I can get from them. I'd rather have a strategy and incentives where I want to make the incentives as large a magnitude as I possibly can and make them operate as efficiently as a stick might, but without the negative occurrence that comes along with the disincentive. The concept of pay value is the perceived positive or negative type of reward associated with adherence to or avoidance of a specific behavior. So if we think about pay values, we really are thinking about what's the nature of that reward that I'm seeking. And the reward ends up being something that translates oftentimes into the motive force. And we're going to talk about how do we maximize the motive force from an incentive program. And that motive force is the extent to which an incentive reward produces compliance with the required behavior of an incentive program or feature. So motive force is how we generally evaluate the effectiveness of our incentive programs. And in general, if we have 100% of eligibles and we get 80% of them responding to the incentive, then the motive force level is 80%. And that's a very effective, very efficient type of incentive device. The pros and cons of incentives are these. The pros are they're flexible. I can modify them. I don't have to build a building to change behavior. I can, in fact, change the rules around behavior. They are fairly easy to do, so I can have the flexibility, but also the ease of use. I can affect multiple behaviors depending on how I design the incentive feature. They can be very powerful if I've chosen the right pay values and I have qualifying behaviors that are appropriate, and my administration of the incentive program is in fact according to what I've planned. So these are some of the major pros that go along with incentives. On the con side, it's not easy for us to know what pay values are the most important and perceived as most valuable by the populations we work with. So we oftentimes have to do some market research to find out what are the aspects of the incentive pay value that need to be included in a particular incentive program or in a particular wellness program. There are unintended artifacts which can possibly happen. So if I'm not careful, I might, for instance, have a weight loss program with no maximum level of weight loss per week. So I may get people doing things that are not very healthy for themselves. They may be purging or using salt and salt derivatives to modify their weight. So unintended artifacts are possible. It also creates potentially a moral hazard. If I set up incentive rules and I say to you, you have to go online and complete your health risk assessment to get the lower premium reduction or premium contribution for your health plan, then I'm setting up a moral hazard by saying to the individual, here's the reward. Now you figure out how to game this and actually complete the HRA, but without really putting much effort into it. So insurance generally creates moral hazard. It's the idea that I now have an incentive to perhaps do something that is amoral or immoral. So that creates a moral hazard. And that's what we call gaming. So we have to design our incentives to minimize the moral hazard or the gaming influences. It also can potentially create dependency. So I get used to my incentive contribution, lower premium contribution, and all of a sudden I want that to be there, and I'm willing to stop doing wellness if you take it away. So that is a dependency creating kind of phenomena. Now, there are definitely critics, and we are going to address the critics at a later point in this module. But there are people that I won't name that basically say it's a bad idea to do any kind of incentives. And I don't agree with that at all. I believe that you can, by careful design and implementation, you can essentially maximize the pros of incentives while minimizing the cons. So I take a very different position than many of the people who are outspoken critics of incentives. But the basic issue is, over the 40 plus years I've been doing programming around wellness with about 1,000 or so employers, I've not found anything but incentives that will in fact get 80 to 85 to 90 to 95% of all employees participating in a wellness program. That doesn't mean that I stopped with the extrinsic reward from the incentive program. It just means that I have opportunity now to cultivate the intrinsic reasons. Are we going to get 100% of the population intrinsically motivated for wellness? I don't think so. I don't think that we'll even get close to that. I think that in wellness is always going to need some incentives in order for people to utilize programs. The potential uses for incentives are many, and it's virtually any behavior that I can codify, that I can define, measure, track, so on. Now, I don't need to track every single behavior. I can set up what are called sentinel features that cause the person to really have a second thought about telling me a lie. So I can, in fact, structure incentives carefully so that people, in fact, respond honestly. And the vast majority, 90% plus, of people will be honest in what they tell you in an incentive program. If you get a very large reward, then you have to establish more objective means of being able to determine, did they do the qualifying behaviors or qualifying requirements. Types of incentive pay values are many, and the primary rewards that I have found and used over the years have been these. I probably would say that avoiding a financial penalty or a financial reward is probably one of the most broadly effective types of pay values. And particularly if I can get the reward size and award size up into the area of around $600 to $1,000 or $1,200 a year. So if I do $100 a month premium contribution and then require that of all employees, and then just tell the employees, if you do the wellness program and you do the following things, you can reduce that, $50 to $100 per month and not have it taken out of your paycheck, you will generally get 90% to 95% of the people actively involved in the wellness program. At the same time, I'm probably going to want to pick up a couple other pay values, probably not more than 4. And recognition might be one that I would use with a particular group, or time off, so I can convert the financial reward into time off, or the ability to have a belonging, a sense that you are a member, an active contributing member of the company, and you're involved in the wellness team or on a wellness team challenge. So there's lots of these pay values that we call primary rewards that can be structured around wellness programs. In addition, there are secondary rewards. So you can see what some of these might be. So these are all the things that I would probably want to put 3 to 5, maybe not more than 5 pay values into my incentive program to get the greatest reach or motive force with the population. Now, the motive force is going to be higher the higher up you are on the list. So if you're picking the ones toward the top, then your motive force is likely to be higher. Now, employers have generally learned that they need incentives. This reflects the performance of Johnson & Johnson's health management system services and on their own employees, their worldwide employees. And they found to complete an annual health risk assessment that if they did not have incentives, they would generally be in the 20 to 30% rank or rate area. And that coincides also with the comment that was made a short time ago about the 20% that are intrinsically motivated for wellness. That can be plus or minus 5% in virtually any workforce. But what they found was that they had to use a $500 to a $600 premium contribution level to actually get 92, 94% rates of completion of the health risk assessment. They're still using that to today. So the ability for us to know and to find out, if I don't use incentives, I'm not likely to get too many more people than just those that are already intrinsically motivated for wellness. And that's one of the things that employers have in fact learned over the years, that incentives are needed for participation. Responding to critics. Here's what I would say to those vocal few critics that don't like incentives. I would say, first of all, that I can, through careful design, eliminate virtually all the disadvantages. So if you tell me that incentives create dependency, I can tell you it depends on the design that you're using and your assumptions about what dependency is likely to be the least amount that we can in fact produce or achieve. And I believe that wellness is not likely to become an intrinsic source of motivation behind wellness for the vast majority of employees. I think it's the minority of employees that will be intrinsically on their own motivated. So careful design can eliminate virtually all the disadvantages that the critics maintain are there. Without incentives, your program is likely to be mediocre at best. So if you are happy with, or your senior management is happy with 20% of employees participating, or 30% of participating, or 40% participating, then don't use incentives. But without incentives, your program is likely to be mediocre at best. How else are you going to easily, and I mean easily, get 80% plus of employees actively involved in wellness? Now, if I can get 80% of employees participating in a wellness program, I can then use other strategies to help enhance their intrinsic reasons for doing it, not just the extrinsic reasons that are associated with a lower premium contribution or additional well days off or various other either tangible or intangible pay values. However, we must move from extrinsic to intrinsic over time. Intrinsic is our gold standard. It's just the problem that no researchers and none of the critics of incentives have come up with any way to create the intrinsic motivation. So you are left to have a wellness program that essentially addresses and kind of preaches to the choir because they're already motivated. Our challenge is getting to the other 80% of employees that are not motivated intrinsically around wellness. And I believe we will never get 100% of employees intrinsically motivated for wellness through whatever means we use. I believe we will always need some incentives to create the reason for people to engage around wellness issues. So these are my primary responses to the vocal critics that oftentimes say, don't use incentives, use culture change, or use other kinds of intrinsic values. Unfortunately, most of them haven't had any experience in terms of being out in the trenches delivering programs and don't have any successful examples of how they would go about turning the program into a more effective base for creating results from a wellness program effort. Now, the wellness incentives best practices include a number of issues. First of all, you have to have the right moving parts. And these three moving parts I've found are critical to the motive force in an incentive program. Our desire and purpose is to increase the motive force to the highest level that we can get to it. So we have 100% of our eligibles. We'd like to have 100% of them actually participating in the incentive program. Well, the three moving parts that are really critical, the first one is the reward. It's the pay values I choose, and I usually want to have 3 to 5 of those pay values chosen and used in the program and advocated or made explicit. The size of the reward is important, the magnitude, and the utility. It's how much of it am I free to use? Are there any restraints on it? When I give out a material good, that's limited in that form. So unless I want to sell it on eBay, I can't convert it into money, which allows me to then pick other things that are more valuable to me. So that reward issue is a very large one. Also, the qualifying activity. Is it reasonable? Is it balanced in terms of the kinds of things that are demanded of me, or is it all loaded up into a narrow area? And is there ease of entry? Can I get into this without having to do a bunch of things? I had one client that I did consulting with, and they said, we've tried incentives and they don't seem to work. And then I started asking them questions, and I said, well, what are your qualifying activities? And they said, well, this, and this. And then I said, well, how much do people have to do in order to qualify for your $100 reward? And they said, well, there's 17 different things you have to do. Well, that's too many. That does not achieve a high motive force. So our qualifying activity is really critical that we design that well. In addition, we have administration of the incentive program. And that means communication, sometimes reminders, sometimes things that people are forgetting that they need to remember. Is our fulfillment as we told them that we were going to do? And is there a culture for this in the culture of the organization? Is that, are they seen as people who do what they say they're going to do? So these three moving parts are what I would call the critical elements in getting a high motive force from any incentive feature or any incentive approach. Now, incentives and best practices usually must evolve over time. And my observation has been that people will tend to move from option 1 to option 5. Sometimes they get stuck. So they end up in option 3 or they end up in option 4. The ideal is down here where we're using a maximum number of wellness criteria, usually not more than 10, but they got to meet 8 out of 10 in order to qualify for that $1,200 reduction in their premium contribution. That then will get you into the high 80s, low 90s in terms of participation level. So what happens is when programs are new, we tend to have a higher level, an artificially higher level of participation. The second year, the third year, the fourth year, the fifth year, the sixth year, that participation will generally drop off. So unless we're doing some things to evolve our wellness incentives, or increasing reward size, or modifying the qualifying behaviors, or doing something like that, we will not maintain the level of participation that we generally would like to see. So where most employers are is somewhere around $150, $200, $250 of reward value. Sometimes that's limited. It's not in cash, but it's in a variety of material goods or limited to certain kinds of use. Those programs do not work as well. They do not give the utility that people want in terms of the freedom to use the reward or freedom to use the amount involved. So there's a rough parallel as you move through these options with a little bit of a hiccup that comes from a new or novelty effect of an incentive. So I may get my first year out, I may get lots of people and I think, oh, this is going to be easy. And then the next year I see the numbers drop off by 30 or 40%. And then the year after, another 30 and 40%. So pretty soon I don't have very many people participating. And then I'm wondering, well, gosh, what happened? So the idea in best practices and incentives is those incentives need to evolve over time. They need to make some, you need to make some modification in them year to year. There needs to be some novelty effects. We need to be giving them life and not just bolting them up and forgetting about them. Another part of incentives is that incentives need to be part of a risk stratification process. So if we're thinking about a population at risk, we're thinking about using a well-being assessment or a well-being survey, and we in fact then can identify groups of people by their strata of risk. We then want to use incentives and communications, which then help people get to the interventions and complete them. So if we have not given thought to how to use incentives to actually get people using the interventions that our health plans offer or our vendors offer or we offer directly, then it's not going to be as good a practice or as good an outcome. So incentives as part of a risk stratification process is probably a best practice for incentives in wellness. Also, another one of the best practices is use of short-term incentive challenges. This is one from WellSteps, a provider that's based in the Salt Lake City area. And they have a number of short-term incentive programs. They're called campaigns, and you can see the description of some of those that are on their website. I would recommend you go and take a look at what they provide. You also have groups that market these kinds of challenges like Health Enhancement Systems of Midland, Michigan. There's also some of these kinds of challenges that are part of WellCOA. So you can find these short-term incentive challenges in a variety of places. So I would suggest to you that a best practice in incentives is to use some of these short-term incentives to structure and set up the long-term incentive. And they need to be easy to do. They need to focus on simple behaviors, usually 3 to 8 weeks in duration, strong social element, easy tracking, recognition, and a link to a long-term incentive. Those are the things that I think are the key characteristics of these short-term incentive challenges that need to be adopted. Now, the use of outcome measures is important as well. So I may have 4 out of 5 criteria, or 6 out of 8, or 8 out of 10, and they'd even be a mix of what the regulations that cover incentives connected to health plans. There are 3 major sets of those, one for the ACA, one for the ADA, and one for the EEOC, that and GINA. Those regs basically say it's okay for us to use participation and outcomes. Many of these issues are what are called health contingent outcomes. So we can in fact have and create incentives that either are 4 out of 5 to get the full reward, 6 out of 8, or 8 out of 10. I like 8 out of 10. I tend to recommend that people think about that. I have my rationale for doing that, which you'll hear about later. But the idea is that we have several things that people can do and that creates a little dynamic in their behavior so that they in fact are looking at these kinds of issues at least once a year to decide whether they do want to get on the wellness bus. Now, to see how that actually plays out, let's take Bill. He's an electrician at a metal fabrication company, and he's right then, signing in on his timesheet. And what you want to do, and what I think we want to do for every employee, is to create a dynamic for behavior change. And at least once a year, I would like each individual employee to ask the question of themselves, do I want to do this wellness stuff? Do I want to get on the wellness bus? And what I would suggest we do to create that dynamic of consideration of a behavior change is to basically say, here, Bill, are the criteria. Now, if you get 8 out of these 10, in this case it's 11, but if you get, if you have a variety, a minimum of those that you meet, we'll give you the full amount. And that may be a $1,200 reduction in your premium contribution. I like those the best because the employer does not need to put up that money. That money can be created by how you rate, what's called rate your health plan cost. So if you are assigning a certain amount to be paid by the employer and a certain amount to be paid by the employee, you can determine how much you're going to charge the employee for health plan coverage. And that then allows me to put that $100 a month premium contribution on top of my funding of my health plan by its rating and its premium cost. And I can have the employee dollars used to create the incentive for Bill and others, co-workers of Bill, to actually be involved in a wellness program, and particularly to complete both outcome and participation related kinds of criteria. So I want to have some ways of being able to have these criteria that have alternatives that people can meet. And I set all those alternative standards up right at the beginning. That helps me meet the requirements of the regulations by having an option or alternative for people. So I can in fact set up this circumstance where Bill and every other employee at least once a year decides, what do I want to do around my wellness? Which of these possible criteria can I meet right now, and which do I have to work on in order to meet? And that's what I would suggest to you is the dynamic that every employee needs to face once a year at least. Now, the ACA final rules, which were published in the Monday, June 3rd, 2013, incentives for non-discriminatory wellness programs and group health plans. The first type of incentive program was called participatory in the regs. And that means if none of the conditions for obtaining a reward under the program is based on the individual satisfying a standard that is related to a health factor, like cholesterol level, blood pressure, BMI, smoking, non-smoking. The wellness program only has to make participation available to all similarly situated individuals. And you can essentially read that as all people with the same benefit coverage. That's a fairly easy way to define similarly situated individuals. The other issue, the second kind that's defined in the regs, and this was picked up again by the regs which have been published since that time, which we'll go over in a moment, health contingent wellness incentive programs. And that's more what we were talking about with Bill. So that health contingent kind of wellness incentive program is that for them to get the reward, if any of the criteria require that they not smoke, or they have a healthy cholesterol level, or a healthy BMI, or whatever it is, then the type of incentive program has to meet 5 requirements. First of all, it has to be an annual qualification. It can't be lifetime. So if you smoke cigarettes, you can't be excluded from the incentive program by your employer for your entire lifetime. Annual qualification. That means, by the way, that annual qualification process is a natural for open enrollment. So I can put my incentive activities right alongside of open enrollment. 2, the limited value of the reward. It can't be any greater than 30% of plan cost or 50% of the plan's cost if it includes smoking. So that's allowed under the regulations. Now, what has also happened is that the newer regs published by the EEOC have essentially said it has to be the single employee 30% of their premium, which is about $1,800. So we still have, we still have the freedom in the ACA regs, but we don't have that freedom if we go by the EEOC regs. So we'll look at that issue in a moment. The third requirement is it must be a legitimate program to promote health or improve or prevent disease. So it can't be something that's discriminatory just on the surface. It has to have a legitimacy that you have a program and incentive to help improve people's health. The fourth requirement is the reward. It needs to be available to all similarly situated individuals. And that also means that I need to make sure there's equity across to my population so that I don't exclude groups inappropriately. From a wellness design standpoint and program design, we want everybody to be included in an incentive. We don't want any group to not be. And we want to be able to respect some of the issues around maybe a physical limitation that somebody might have. So I then have to have full disclosure of the availability of alternative standards and an opportunity for people to waive and have the requirements waived if they can't meet them. So I need to have in my incentive program the ability to take individual circumstances and really look at them and say, okay, what's a good alternative standard or what's a potential waiver for this particular issue? And can we go ahead and give that waiver? So those 5 criteria are what are required if we're going to do health contingent wellness incentive programs. These are not a problem. We can do these things fairly easily, and I'm going to also tell you what I believe are the best ways for you to eliminate all regulatory risk from your incentive design. Now, the EEOC final regulations have just been published in the May of 2016. So this Federal Register, these are sequential regs, so they essentially run from page 311.43 up to 311.59. So these you can actually get these regs if you want to by going into your browser, putting federal regs in, and then the date, May 17th, 2016. Then up come these final rules. And under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, actually administers, and GINA, which is the Genetic Information Non-Disclosure Act. Those 2 acts are designed to keep employees from being discriminated against. So under the ADA and GINA, the language from the EEOC staff basically allows disability-related inquiries or medical examinations as part of wellness programs. So they can in fact be there, but they have to be voluntary. And voluntary means it's not a mandatory requirement. There's no denial of health insurance coverage if you don't agree to do it, and no retaliation. Those are very reasonable. The employer must give notice of what medical information is to be collected, how it's to be used, who gets it, any restrictions on its use or access, and methods used to prevent unauthorized disclosures. So that's another part of what the regs deal with. And then under GINA, very much the same issues, except the employer cannot use any inducements to get genetic information about the spouse. And the value for the incentive in the GINA regs is limited to the employee-only coverage, which is about 6,000 to 7,000. So 30% of 6,000 to 7,000 is what you can use as your largest amount of value, or the total amount of value connected to your wellness incentive program. And then the notification requirements are ditto to the ADA portion of the regs. So what this basically did is it caused the EEOC to align with the ACA regs and to then also put some protections in so that employees are not unreasonably at risk to employer arbitrary decisions about the wellness incentive efforts. So this is designed to help us kind of get a level playing field and it gives us plenty of room to maneuver on that level playing field. Now, to prevent any compliance problems with those three sets of regs, here's what you should do. First of all, don't make any wellness activity mandatory. So basically, you leave it out for everybody. You may create an incentive which makes it very desirable for them to attend an orientation or to complete an HRA, whatever it is, but don't make it a mandatory requirement. Link the incentive reward to annual health plan premium discount. So that's a way to be able to connect it. Now you could use also a health savings account amount. So, but that's connecting to our premium discount. Third, keep your total reward value below 30% of the total health plan cost for a single employee. And that's going to mean 30% of $6,000 or $1,800. If it was $7,000 for cost of the total health plan premium for the single employee, then it becomes $2,100. So I can keep my $1,200 below that 30% threshold pretty easily. Allow everyone to participate, fully meet all notification requirements, automatically provide alternative ways of meeting all the requirements. And the way you do that is you basically say you can either be a non-smoker, you can have engaged in a smoking cessation program. You can have also be working with a coach around this, or you can complete an online learning management system module. I can meet the requirement for smoking and tobacco use by meeting any one of those four. That way you've said and stated your alternative standards right up front. And that's what gives people plenty of opportunity to use different approaches depending on what they want to do. For disabled employees, have individually developed alternative standards. So have a provision for you to work with the disabled employee, the employee that may be in a wheelchair or the employee that may not be sighted, that you in fact have ways of being able to work with them around appropriate alternative standards. And if you can't find a standard that they agree to, then waive the standard requirement. When in doubt, waive the requirements and give the reward. We're not trying to use this to penalize people. We want everybody actively supporting and wanting to get on the wellness bus. And when you can, always use tiered rewards. Never all or none. The problem with all or none rewards is either you meet all the criteria or you don't get any reward. What you want is to have maybe 3 tiers. Full reward, a kind of first level, second level. So if I have 10 criteria and I meet only 5 of them, I may get a $300 reduction in my premium contribution. If I meet 7 of them, I might get a $600 reward. Or if I meet 8 out of 10, I may in fact get a full $1,200 of reward. So use a tiered reward structure. Don't use all or none, because what happens under all or none is people get discouraged. They decide not to get on the bus, not to even work on it, not to even be involved in that dynamic. So you don't want that to happen. So create some tiered rewards. It then keeps them in the game year over year. And you want to evaluate your incentive program annually to see how strong the motive force is, how people are reacting to it from a satisfaction vantage point. Are there any complaints about it? So those are evaluation issues for your incentive program that you would conduct on an annual basis. So these are the preventive management, preventive maintenance issues of how to eliminate compliance problems of any of the ACA, the EEOC, the ADA, or GINA requirements and final rules. Now, another one of the best practices, besides meeting these compliance-related issues, is to use employee dollars to create the motive force. And here we give an example where there's an $1,150 average monthly premium. The employee pays a small share of that, and the employer pays the bulk of it. And then you add on to the top that $100 a month premium contribution. And if the individual is participating in the wellness program, and we can define that in lots of different ways, then that individual pays $100 less per month. If they are non-participant, don't want to get on the wellness bus, don't want to have anything to do with that wellness program, then they pay the full amount. They would pay their employee share of that $1,150, and then the $100 above that, which would mean $1,250 total cost, with the employee picking up, the portion that's their regular share plus that $100. Now that is a play or pay approach. So the idea is that because of the effect of all of these health risk and health risk factors on increased spending in a health plan, we want employees to have some consequence when they choose not to deal with their own wellness. So they're going to pay a little bit more for their health plan, and that's about $1,200 a month, or $1,200 a year rather, not a month. Now, other ideal or best practice considerations are relevant behavioral targets, that's the qualifying behavior, good communications, attractive rewards, maybe some ways of converting the reward from money to time off, clear rules, balanced effort, streamlined recording and record keeping, efficient administration. You want the honor system. You don't want to be creating incentive programs that are designed like the wellness police are going to get you. You want an honor system, and you want to use both strong retention in your incentive program so that people come back into it each year, targeted evaluation, appropriate Sentinel features. And Sentinel features are those things, we have a module that's in preparation for going through all the different 20 plus different Sentinel features that you can build into the incentive program to get honest responses and to get people continuing to participate. And we want modifications over time. So we want to make improvements in the wellness program as it evolves over time. We also want it producing a high level of motive force. So we want to be up in that 60%, 70%, 80%, 90% participation in the incentive program. And that participation in the incentive program would have translation into multiple interventions in the wellness program. Now, the strategies for moving from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation for wellness are included in one of the articles for the Level 4 course. And it involves consistently emphasizing the personal benefits. So the more that I can ask people, what is their personal reason for doing this? Why are they doing this? And I can feed that back to them, that's going to help them move more toward the intrinsic. Also, if I can coach them using motivational interviewing techniques, which also build on that premise. So the ability for me to build that into the coaching process is going to help the conversion from extrinsic to intrinsic. Third, if I can emphasize the long-term perspective in my communication, if I can talk to people about this being an investment in their own health and well-being. So it's not just the extrinsic present moment issue, it's also how the extrinsic is helping them do this on the longer term and to have the benefit associated with that accrue to them. The fourth issue or strategy is to link to group competition. So I can in fact bring them into a belonging and achievement and contribution by being able to get them connected to a team or to a work unit and have that work unit group competition be something that coalesces around the issue. So it's not necessarily the benefit in the health plan by a lower premium contribution. It's also my relationship with my coworkers. And number 5 is incorporate personal objectives. So if I can help the individual develop some wellness objectives and goals themselves, then I can emphasize that and I can have that be part of what is helping me move the individual from an entirely extrinsic reason for doing the wellness to an intrinsic related reason. The 6th strategy is to emphasize in my communications, coaching and contact with the individual, all the materials and messaging that go back and forth, is do this for yourself and your family. We're setting this up to make it easy for you and to give you motivation and some sources of extrinsic motivation to do wellness, but do wellness for yourself and for your family. And lastly, start evaluating on the intrinsic. So when we evaluate things, we give people messages about the importance of whatever it is we're evaluating. So if we begin to start asking people how and what is their intrinsic reason for doing this, and I begin trying to create, for instance, indexes or questions that I can then index into a scale, I can then convert more of that extrinsic into intrinsic. Now, the critics of wellness basically say you don't want a wellness program that's driven by extrinsics. You want intrinsic reasons for people to do behavior, and they evaluate extrinsics like incentives on how much intrinsic motivation they establish. Well, if you just do an extrinsic based wellness program with a link to your health plan premium, you'll get 90% of the people doing wellness. But unless you do these additional strategies, you won't help them convert from the extrinsic to the intrinsic. And on top of that, a portion of those, a major portion, are never going to become intrinsically motivated no matter what you do. So I can keep them doing wellness if I use extrinsic wisely, but I also then have some parallel strategies I'm using to convert that extrinsic source of motivation to intrinsic. Now, the summary of key points for this particular module. CE module is incentives are needed in every program if you want to reach the unmotivated 80%. So if we want to reach the motivated ones, the intrinsically motivated ones, that's what our wellness programs do now. If we want to get to the other 80% that are not participating in our programs by and large, then we have to do something different. Incentives are not a panacea, but they are usually critical to success. So if I want to have more than just a mediocre wellness program, I'm going to have to be thinking about incentives. Many possible behaviors can be incented. Many types of rewards or pay values can be used. And I can select those that maximize the motive force. I just need to do some research and do some survey work and some things to help me figure out which of those pay values do I want to include in the wellness program and the incentive feature of that program. Communication and magnitude of reward are key. Incentives can definitely increase participation and engagement. We don't have good long-term evidence that incentives, however poorly designed, and many of them are poorly designed, have not demonstrated that they can turn a non-smoker or a smoker into a non-smoker, or a non-exerciser into an exerciser, or cause someone to keep their BMI within certain limits. But what we do have is an enormous amount of research that says I can actually get people participating and doing the behaviors. So I don't put an unreasonable expectation on incentives that they're somehow supposed to fix the problem in every case. The incentive is a tool for me to use to get people engaged in wellness, and so that I can in fact do some of these other strategies to help them develop the intrinsic rationale and the intrinsic reason for doing wellness. Health plan and employer incentives must be administratively efficient and targeted appropriately. So we still need to be careful about how we design them and what we target them on. Incentives can help produce a significant amount of economic savings. So I have produced for my clients over the years large amounts of return on investment because the incentives have oftentimes been well designed, well implemented. They can be connected to many other aspects of the workplace in a complementary way. And what we do in the level 4 program is we talk about how do you connect return to work and issues around the use of disease management or the use of large case management to actually help people have some incentives for them to engage with those resources and those services. So they can be connected in many different ways to other health-related functions that are carried out for these working populations. So these are the summary of key points from this particular module entitled Incentive Deep Dive. And they need to be carefully designed and implemented. Kind of my last comment, that these incentives need to be carefully designed and implemented in a way that makes sense. We can't just put a nominal amount of effort or a little bit of energy into this and then leave them alone. We don't bolt them into place and then stand back. We have to actively manage them. Now, some key questions. Will we always need incentives for wellness? My response is yes. We will always need incentives for wellness. If we used our heads and were reasonable, I think that we would be able to accumulate a good deal of insight into how to set up incentives, kind of behavioral economic incentives particularly. And those we need to have around for the long haul. So I don't think that we can have incentives for just a 2 or 3 year period and then leave them behind. I think they're going to have to be built into our approach to wellness for the foreseeable future. Second question is, what long-term perspective should we have on the use of incentives? And I would suggest that your long-term perspective is that we are going to need to have some extrinsic reasons for people to engage in wellness. We will always need that. So let's change up. Let's have some different things. Let's be creative in our design of incentives. Let's have some movement in this area. Let's learn and let's try out different things, so that long-term perspective needs to be there. I think we also need to be able to look at it and say, how can I be improving the effectiveness, the motive force of my incentive programs, and what can I be doing to actually help increase that intrinsic source of motivation? And then how do I measure that on an annual basis to help guide my efforts? So that long-term perspective is in fact very important. The other issue is we need to be using the information about the relationship of health risk to health cost, both workers' comp, disability, presenteeism, sick leave, and health plan cost. So if we are not educating our employers and our senior management about the relationship between people's weight and their weight management, or their BMI, or their use of tobacco, or their use of preventive screening, or seat belts, or distracted driving, or sleep, quality of sleep. If we are not connecting the economic dots for our senior management, then we're going to have a hard time funding wellness and keeping it in place. Third question is, how should I recommend funding our incentives? I believe that the employees should pick up the funding on the incentive. And that means that I want to use a premium contribution under Section 105 of the IRS code that covers medical benefits. And that's tax advantage to both the employer and the employee. So I don't have to worry about taxes. I have payroll systems that can give me some tiered incentives and tiered amounts. I can add it on above the funding of the actuarial funding base of the health plan, and I can put it into almost virtually any context. So the ability for us to use employee dollars to fund the incentive programs and then let the employer pay for the actual wellness program interventions. So if the cost of coaching, or the cost of well-being surveys, or the cost of eHealth portals, that should be covered by the employer. So it is how we should achieve a partnership where the employee picks up some of the incentive costs for the wellness program and the employer picks up the rest of the program cost. And I think that that's how I would recommend that you fund your incentives. Now that you've completed this particular module, go ahead and take the quiz.